Good. So I wrote that during lunchtime, so please be indulgent. It's not really well finished, nor but it took too much time. So my idea was talking about the notion of scriptability in scientific applications. So we've talked a lot in the past 2-3 days, if not last years, about this great tool around the IPython kernel, which is the IPython notebook. And that thing is a research tool which is like really awesome. Now, when you deploy an application to, let's say, a large corporation that solves a business problem, most of the time it's not an IPython notebook. Typically, it's going to be like some sort of a clearly designed application with requirements, some specs. It will be focused on solving one problem, or maybe multiple problems, or a set of problems, but it's going to be some sort of a locked down stuff. Very often, it's going to be either a web interface or like something like that, where you have like a real fat client on your machine. If you compare that to non-scientific application, when you think about Word or things like that, so those are like applications, they have a clear set of requirements, they have some specs, every time you have a new version, blah, 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 blah. And so you can apply that to many, many things that you can do on a daily basis as a researcher when you want to share your, let's say, you're working on image analysis, you have a small tool which allows you to do like event extractions or things like that. You want to share that with some other colleagues that don't know anything about it, but they just want to be able to just push on 2 buttons and get a result. It's quite nice to be able to just provide them with an application. Now the application is going to have probably a UI, you'd say using Qt or WX or other things. Very often, so you focus on exposing one feature or 2 features, like feature extraction or I don't know, event identification, creation of a report or things like that. You have like buttons, menu items, and so on. So that's part of your user interface. Now, I personally think it's critical for many, many cases to provide much more than just that little user interface, because that one focuses on solving one problem, where typically the content of your application can solve way more. And so if you can expose the rest, you basically give a lot of power to the end user, potentially. And at Enso, this is something we do in pretty much all the applications we've built in the past. So you most of the time have access to some sort of a scripting engine in your application. For example, over there, like the tank that you see there is entirely scriptable. So you can just like switch into scripting mode where you can start designing like how the propeller is going to be done, how many of those you're going to have, the size, and so on and on and on. So everything should be scriptable in those kind of applications. So why do you want to have this scriptability? So the first idea is you want to empower the user. You really want to sort of like improve or give an environment where creativity is open. And so if you're using, just thinking about the use case where you have an application which does image processing, you have like plenty of users. They're going to be from different domain or different backgrounds. Some of them will look at your application and think, hey, so what if I could do this or that? Or what if I take this image down and just add like another step in the processing because I want to remove some contrast before doing this second step, for example. So if you allow them to do that, you really empower them to do like way more than what the application initially provides. And that's quite important when you have scientific applications, because typically you're in environments where you want to go faster, you want to go better, you want to improve things. We talk more and more about data scientists. If you think about the data science process, the workflows in companies, you need to tweak them all the time. You need to have people that are just looking at the big picture and just think, hey, so what if we can do that? What if we can integrate that data set or merge those 2 streams or do things like that? So I think this is like really critical. The second point about empowering the users is the fact that it's really candies for the power users, and that looks stupid, but this is super important. Most of the time you have, let's say, 95% of your users that are like basic users. They want to have buttons. They're really happy with like the menu items and so on. And then you have 5% that are the power users. Those guys, most of the time, are also the ones that convince the management that they should buy your application. So if you provide them with the tools that will help them like solve the problems faster, better, and with just like some sort of a better approach to the problem, they're going to be very, very happy. Sometimes you have to be careful in what you expose, but that's some sort of a different problem. So if you make your application scriptable, typically that's going to be something really, really good for power users or advanced users. The second interesting thing about scriptability is that, I don't know how many of you have done like UI work, so building user interfaces on machines, so like fat clients, like quite a lot. How many of you do think that building UIs is easy? 0. So I think one of the good things here is that you can basically focus on building a very simple user interface which solves one problem, even if your application in the backend can do like way more. So you basically limit the amount of work that, or the things you have to expose in the user interface by just focusing on exactly what was in the requirement. But next to that, you open the back door, the scriptable door basically. And once you do that, now you can do like way more. So that basically helps you like sort of decreasing the amount of UI work that you might want to have to do if you want to expose everything and just focus on the most important one. And also at the same time get the maximum from your application because you basically expose way more. Yeah, the user interface also, like typically when you spec something like that, it's just one view on the problem, and most of the time you have multiple views on the problem. In some other case, you can even think that the user interface is a user interface on top of a library which does some things, and so in some case you have a server which basically uses the very same library to do something completely different. So by decoupling all that, and again exposing potential access to the internals there, you basically have, I think, great benefits. And the last point is, when you have scriptability in an application, it's some sort of a way to train people to use it or to discover the internals or things like that. I'll show you some examples in a minute on how you can basically provide like some sort of a conversion for your beginners to how do you become an advanced user? If you think about Excel is probably not the tool that everybody loves, but if you look at the macro recording that they have there, it's pretty compelling. It's interesting. So you just like push on the red button, you get a script, you read the script, and you sort of understand what happens, which means that the next time you might be the one writing that script in place of like recording it because the recording didn't do exactly what you wanted and things like that. So it's clearly one really interesting point there. So how can you make your application scriptable? So you have like multiple ways to do that. The first way is basically having very, very simple scripting, and scripting just means you write something in a file and you execute that file. That means that you have provided to the user, for example, some sort of an API documentation, and now when he starts the application, which does, let's say, image processing, he can write a little script which says, okay, that's step 1, that's step 2, that's step 3, and so on, and you get the output which basically is displayed like this. So that would be the most basic scripting capabilities that you can have. And so in that case, you just need to allow the user to load and run some scripts in your application. The second one is, I think, the most important one is the interactive scripting. And so interactive scripting, if we go back to the IPython ID that I raised starting the talk there, the IPython client, the one from 2 years ago, was already like this first very, very interesting step in being able to do that. Because if we're taking the IPython client and putting that in your application, now you have something which is really nice because you can potentially put things in the namespace of the IPython kernel and start playing with the application or typing in the IPython kernel, interacting with the application, and so on. So that's for the interactive scripting, and interactive scripting can be done like in a basic way by just exposing an interpreter so that you can type commands, or directly integrating that with the full application, which means that you can also potentially take UI element, drop them in the IPython engine, and now you can directly use those ones. Again, I'll show you some examples in a minute. And then you can now start merging all the concepts together and have applications where you can start from starting the application. It exposes a command line, an interpreter. You can drag and drop some stuff down there, do some, let's say, discovery of your object on the command line. From there, you can start potentially like recording your session. Recording your session gives you the potential script that you're going to reuse. In your application, you expose a way for managing those little scripts. You allow the user to have like key bindings to that, and you're now very close to like potential simple macro recording support for your application and so on. Does that make sense? Any questions? Examples. So I have 3 examples. So the first one, I wrote that one like during lunch. So I hope it's going to work properly. I just reused an example of the Chaco library, which is a 2D plotting library, which allows you to interact, like, let's say, in an easy way with data. And what I wanted was not adding the scriptability inside of the application, but being able to connect something to my application. So it basically starts the app, and then you can connect with an IPython client into it and start scripting it. And so scripting, you're just going to see what it does. So I'll show you the running application first, and then we can quickly look at the code. Where is the code? Oh, that's the wrong one. Yeah, sorry. That's the one. So here's the app. The app allows you to take a function, which is defined in 2 dimensions, or 3 dimensions with the column map, basically. And it's going to show you the output of the function in a 2D plot with slices, so that you see exactly how the values are evolving. You have some ways to edit the model. So this is the function which is used, the number of points, blah, blah, blah. So you directly look at the function, you say, no, that's wrong. So you change the value. And you see that you directly you have like all the updates that are there. How this is written is basically using traits and Chaco. You have a clear separation between a model, which is the one that provides the data, and then the view there, which basically is like showing the content of the model. And so my idea is I want to allow people to script that application. So I want to be able to connect to that and have access to the model and to the view. So that I can, from the command line, start doing pretty much the same thing. Like I want to be able to change some of the attributes here. Potentially from the command line, I could also say, hey, here is a new model, which is completely different, but has the right API for my view, and just change it. That's going to work also. So how I did that, I basically took in the IPython repository, you have an example of an embedded IPython kernel. So that's not the in-process one. It's really just the kernel that you can run in the same process. And so when I started my app, you see that over here, you basically have the information about the connection to the kernel that basically runs into the app. Which means that now if I start a Qt console, IPython Qt console, and I pass the existing kernel information, so it pops up with the Qt console, and so I just can ask who's there, and you see that I started my app, already have access to my model and my view. And so those are basically my application injecting the model and the view inside of the IPython namespace. So now if I look at my UI, I'm going to make that smaller. Yep. Yeah. That typically it's some sort of the thing that you have like when you build a research tool, not really like well finished. So now if I look at my model, so model is traits, so I can ask for all the traits. And you see that the traits are, we see the function there. So now if I don't agree with the change, so I can just, for example, change the function again to the old value. So that's the current value. And the new value is going to be model.function is equal to the square of x. And now I just have direct interaction with my data. You can do like everything. You have access to everything. So you can write any kind of code inside of the IPython kernel there that's executing the same process and start interacting with the data. So if you look at the view has a column map, if I remember correctly, column map. So if you want to change that to RDBU, now you directly interact with your data. Now, it's not a super interesting example in terms of what you can do there, but think about, I don't know, an optimization application where you can potentially access different kind of solvers, and there is only one which is exposed in the UI, or you want to change the data, or you want to like start filtering some of the data there, like if I want to remove all the values that are like above a certain level or things like that. So the only thing that it took me to do that is, I think, importing, so I think I added 5 lines or 4 lines to my code. So I quickly hide the fact that the shutting down is basically causing some issues at the moment, but that's something that's going to be fixed. So I basically imported this internal IP kernel, which is a very simple. Look at the definition of the object. It's like very, very basic. all of the rest of the code hasn't been touched, and then I did one in the main. I create a kernel. I initialize that with Qt4 because everything is based on Qt here. I set up my plot, which is like all the trade stuff, and then I get back the reference to the model and the view. And so here, in a very naive way, I just add this model and that view in the namespace of the kernel, which means that as soon as it's over there, it's available to all of the clients. And then I start the IP kernel, and so that's basically starting the UI main loop plus all the ZMQ stuff and so on. Yes? Yes. Yes, that's important. Yeah. So you're in the Python world, so you can do pretty much anything you can do while you're on the interpreter. So you can, even if you choose just to expose that, so there are still ways to like get backdoors if needed. But yeah, we're all adults, and typically when you deploy your app in a corporate environment, so the guys are not going to do like, yeah, if they do stupid things, so they're really responsible for that. But it's important to be aware of like what you do there and what you put there in the namespace. So that's the first very basic example. You see that it's not that complex. There are still some little things to fix, like with the UI interactions there, but that's not a big deal. Second example is it's a pretty old example. It's MyAV 2. And so why do I show that one? Because what? The beauty of pair programming. So here is MyAV. So for those of you who don't know MyAV, it's basically a pretty nice tool built on top of VTK, which allows you to do like really interesting 3D visualization pipelines based on like pretty much any kind of data. So if I use that, I'm going to load some data. Boom, open file. That's not the right one. Project ETS. MyAV. Examples. Data. And so there is a VTK file there. So that basically has loaded some a data set with like, I think it's heart blood pressure or something like that. And so now I can now add some rendering modules on top of that. So for example, you want to see that with ISO surfaces. You want to have, oh, what are the details there? View, object editor, yep, auto controls. I want to see 10 of those. And now you see the value like in the 3D viewer. So the interesting thing you have in MyAV, and that was existing from like years, is the fact that you can just take this ISO surface, drop it in the Python prompt, and now you have access to, the ISO surface, and you can start discovering basically what kind of API it shows to you. So if you know a little bit about how things are organized on there, for example, there is, on all those objects, an actor. The actor has some properties. And so the properties, there is one which is the opacity, for example, opacity. And so if you want to set that to 0.5, oh, man. So, up. Let me just go back there. There is tab completion, so that helps also. Property, opacity, equal to 0.5. So now you basically have direct interaction with all the objects down there. You have a little bit more than that. So if those objects do have UI components, you can also do things like this. So here I'm just asking to the actor, give me your user interface. And now it just popped up the UI. So if you have like really complex nested objects with like configuration files for your simulation runs and blah, 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 you can potentially at any point just stop, get a reference to the right thing, expose the UI, and so on and on and on. So that's, I always mention this because I basically don't know VTK at all. I'm using MyAV very often. And this is one great way to basically like interact with all that and understand so how the library is basically created behind the hood and what you can do with it.
Can you show the record button?
So that's the thing. So there is a record button, which is really awesome because that one allows you to do even more. Now here you've seen that I loaded some file, I did a new module, potentially added some filtering and so on. But you do that from the UI. How do you do that in code? If you can push on the record button, it's going to show you the entire code to do all that. And so, and it's going to be readable, which is great. The problem is that in that version, the record button has disappeared. I think the Qt menu bar basically is not shown. So there is a bug that we need to fix. And if I switch to the one on WX, late WX 2.9 version, there is just like completely screwed. So we need to fix that. But so the record button is really, really useful, and that's also definitely connected with the scriptability of your application. Question on this? I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to run on the last example. No? I have time for another example? Perfect. That's good. So, back to the slides. So we had the very basic one with the embedded IPython kernel. With MyIV, we have a basic, an advanced interpreter. It's not the IPython kernel, but basically some sort of, it's the ancestor or something like that. It has drag and drop support, and it has a macro recording capability. And then the last example, and initially my talk was about basically using the open source stack for building a scientific application for large corporation. And so I just switched into the scripting idea. And so here I'm going to demo Canopy Geo, which is one product that Enthone has built. And so that one has some sort of like all the integrated stuff around scriptability. So there is an embedded IPython kernel. That one is in process with the client in process. We have drag and drop support for pretty much all the objects. You have a basic macro recording support. That one is like not that great, but it's like it's going to be improved. And then we also go up to the point where documentation browser, which is integrated in the app, basically is connected with the scripting engine. So when you have snippets of code, you can just click on them and it's going to be executed directly in the app. And so that really gives some sort of an environment for users to learn and basically discover the application from the UI to the scripting layers. And that's really, really useful. Boom, where is it now? I think, let's see if it works. So what can you do there? So you can do plenty of different things. So you have the drag and drop support within the application, but also outside of the application. So I can potentially take, let's say, let's take an Horizon file. I think that one should work. So I've just loaded some data here. Not happy. I dropped my Horizon, so that's a geophysics, basically like some geophysics information. I dropped the Horizon on a 3D view. Now I have my IPython prompt here with a number of things. Like I have access to the data manager of the application, the IO manager of the application, and so on and on and on. You can also just take your objects, drop the object down here, and now you have access to horizon.printrate, the details of your object. And so from there you can start like doing some, whatever you want. Potentially you could say, hey, I want to look at the data in a different way, not in 3D because I don't care about 3D. I want to have like 2D support. So I can just do from PyLab or from Matplotlib, from PyLab, import, show and plot. And then you can take the, let's say some of the data, horizon dot, what is it? How to access the big data there? Yeah, you can take any of those, any of the attributes on there and just like plot that. You can potentially load, I don't know, scikit-learn and start doing some like clustering on some data and so on and on and on. So you have like no boundaries there. The only boundaries that you have is the libraries that you have access to in your interpreter, basically, that's it. And the fact that you're within another application. Now you can go from here back to the application, so you can push results back. You can start like interacting both ways. And as I told you, so now you're going to go a little bit further than that. So once you have understood like how you're going to build some stuff on the command line, you have the notion of macros. And so those ones are small scripts that you can potentially just run. And so, for example, I have one script which takes care of loading a full data set. So if I run that, now this is basically just executing some stuff within the application. And now I just loaded like some Horizon file plus some well logs. Now, if you think about, and that's exactly how those things were built. So at one point, we had one guy looking at that. So I have some horizons, some well logs. The well logs are crossing the horizons at some point. So I was like, hey, I can potentially use SciPy and some of the NumPy stuff. I'm going to detect where I have intersections. And then after that, I'm going to use some information coming from the logs to do interpolation on top of the horizons. So he wrote a very basic script, compute intersection. Yep. And so now the red dots, they are basically like the intersection between the well logs and the horizons. And so all the initial steps were done on the command line, like extracting information, like playing with that, up to the point where the script is like working. And finally, you can just like use those intersections to interpolate some data on top of those horizons. And now those are the results with the interpolated values, and so on. You basically have no limits there. Now, when you have scripts like that, so there are other things that you can do. So you can basically push that to, let's say, the next level, where you can look at a script, extract the inputs and the outputs. And so in this case, you can see this is the script that we use. You have an input context and an output context. Start looking at dependency analysis and start connecting all that, building pipelines. And so all that is driven by the scriptability idea. So I think, yeah, that's probably where I would conclude my talk. So I'm going to answer all the questions you have, if you have some of those. But I think this is like a critical feature for all the scientific application, because it really helps you, first of all, design the next generation of your application. It helps also the user basically providing like feedback on what they really need, what they really want. That's sometimes very hard for them. So if you let them play with the data, they can just come back to you with like some really interesting suggestions. And I think that's more than likely how things should evolve when you look at how we start doing, how we continue doing science today. We need to go faster. We need to be more flexible. We need to be able to like rework those pipelines all the time, add new ideas, test new things. So that's it.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Are there questions? If maybe time for a couple of questions. Everybody is so impressed by the capabilities which you showed. Yeah.
So I've never embedded an IPython kernel. Are there any gotchas that are worth, or never exposed an internal one? Are there any? I've never played with embedding an IPython kernel and exposing it as an interface. Are there any gotchas to be aware of?
So the first one is like the fact that you have like the UI main loop and the ZMQ main loop that basically need to like properly work together. The fact that you have access from the outside. You can connect multiple clients there. The clients need to be responsible for what they do, so they can potentially break your app from the outside. But you always have to manage that, and that's exactly the same if you had an IPython kernel in process, so that doesn't change anything. So it's mainly like the event loops that are like...
So if you've got a back-end process with no GUI exposed, is there anything to worry about? Or you could have a long-running process running and just have another exposed interface?
It depends how you set things up, but that shouldn't be a big worry.
Okay, I think we move on. So thanks again for this nice talk.